Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming today to the first Monday Forum of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Normally, first Mondays occur on the first Monday of the month, but we had a holiday last week, in case you didn't notice, so that's why we're doing it today. But really glad you can all attend, and thank you for those listening online as well. The topic today is about our first public diplomacy efforts when we were not even a nation yet. To celebrate our 250th birthday, we're going to look way back 2.5 centuries and figure out how we used public diplomacy to win the most important battle we fought, which was become a nation. So how did a fragile coalition of 13 colonies, I sound like the beginning of Hamilton here, win the hearts, minds, and wallets of Europe's superpowers? Long before the term public diplomacy was ever coined, America's founding fathers were master practitioners of the art. Confronted with a global superpower, the British Empire, they recognized that winning their independence required more than just battlefield victories. It also demanded a sophisticated campaign to shape public opinion and secure foreign alliances abroad. With us to discuss these efforts today, we're very delighted to introduce Martha Bayles, who has published widely on culture, journalism, and U.S. public diplomacy. She is TV critic for the National Review, as well as film critic for the Claremont Review of Books and a contributor to the Atlantic and Wall Street Journal book section. She's a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies of Culture at the University of Virginia, my alma mater. Wahoo! And she is currently working on a book about the informal norms that have historically sustained America's regime of free speech. Very important topic now. She is also the author of Through a Screen Darkly, Popular Culture, Public Diplomacy, and America's Image Abroad, Yale Press 2014, if you want to go on Amazon and order it. She teaches interdisciplinary seminars in humanities and politics at Boston College. Our second speaker today is Dr. Caitlin Schindler, who currently serves as adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics and teaches a course on public diplomacy and strategic communication. She works full-time as a management consultant focused on program evaluation, and she is the author of another book you may want to order called The Origins of Public Diplomacy in US Statecraft, Uncovering a Forgotten Tradition, 2018. Her current research focuses on how different state and non-state actors use propaganda, public diplomacy, and political warfare to achieve their strategic objectives. And finally, we have another best-selling author, Eric Weiner, who is also a keynote speaker and writing instructor. And his most recent book, again, Amazon.com, is Ben and Me, In Search of a Founder's Formula for a Long and Useful Life, probably referring to Ben Franklin. Yes. His work has been translated into more than 24 languages. He's a former foreign correspondent for NPR, and his writing has appeared in The Atlantic, National Geographic, The Wall Street Journal, and the anthology Best American Travel Writing. He also serves on the board of Alan Chus International Writers Center at George Mason University, and he teaches an annual writing workshop in Bhutan. And most people cannot say that. Our moderator today is Gordon Duguid. Gordon is the McHenry Visiting Professor of Diplomacy and International Relations at Illinois State University, a retired Foreign Service officer and colleague, a member of PDCA, and also an author of Counter Narrative, a novel about public diplomacy and the Foreign Service. So we have a lot of authors to get into this very thoughtful topic today. Delighted to have them all. When we finish their presentations, we will have time for questions and answer. If you're online, please submit your questions through our website, and we will read them here to the crowd. If you're in person and you'd like to ask a question, please come up to the microphones to do so. And thank you, and let's get started. Gordon, all yours.
Thank you, Carl, for those remarks. And in the interest of giving our speakers the maximum amount of time and your questions the maximum amount of time, I would like to go directly to Martha Bayles in Boston for her opening remarks. Martha.
Okay, hello. Being on Zoom and an in-person event is the absolute definition of being a wallflower. I have not been able to meet any of you in person, and so I'm here on the screen. Okay, I'll start. I've spent the past few months writing reviews and essays about the representation of the American Revolution in films and television series. I can tell you up front that if I were going to share one production to dub into hundreds of languages and distribute throughout the world, it would be Ken Burns' masterpiece, The American Revolution. But among the drama series, which generally are more popular, I've found nothing better. I've tried, but I found nothing better than the 2009 HBO series John Adams, based on the wonderful biography by David McCullough. With regard to this meeting, what's most striking about a number of these programs is their depiction of two founding Americans, John Adams and Ben Franklin, in the court of Louis XVI as they negotiated the first treaties of alliance seeking French assistance in the War of Independence. In both films, and more important in reality, both Adams and Franklin came off as rustic characters, somewhat out of place among the silks and powdered wigs and affectations of the French court. But only one of them managed to fit in anyway, and indeed become celebrated in that same court, and that was, of course, Ben Franklin. He arrived with a great advantage of being a world-famous scientist and inventor. As the French put it at the time, he invented electricity. He was also a famous pamphleteer and political operative. But beyond that, he had a collection of skills that definitely did not go with his rustic appearance, his fur hat, his ordinary clothes, and his walking stick, etc. Those skills were those of a gentleman, indeed, to the French, of an aristocrat. They included wit, refined manners, interest in science and reason, a way with the ladies, and extraordinary tact and discretion when engaging in diplomacy. Now, I say diplomacy because this part of Franklin's work was old-fashioned diplomacy in the sense of a lengthy interaction with high French officials. I wish the Apple TV series starring Michael Douglas had devoted more time to the games of mental chess played between the wily Franklin and the equally wily French foreign minister, Comte de Vergennes, whose role is played with great humor and subtlety by the fine French actor Thibault de Montalembert. Without those French actors and locations, this series would not exist. So it by itself is an alliance. But I didn't like the way this series portrayed John Adams as a tactless bumpkin incapable of diplomacy. Adams could be tactless, but he was not stupid. Far more accurate is the depiction in the HBO series of a plain-spoken Yankee put off by the aristocratic airs and morals of the French court, who eventually managed to impress at least some of them with his intelligence and his wit. I mention these depictions because Franklin and Adams in the French court, as I overheard the group already talking about, tell us something unique and significant about American public diplomacy, and not just at the beginning. That is the combination of diplomacy on the aristocratic or ambassadorial level of high officials speaking to high officials, and, more important, the cultivation of goodwill among the common people by American visitors as representatives of the democratic spirit. This has remained the central challenge of American public diplomacy ever since, and Franklin is, of course, the first exemplar. But Adams is important in another way. I would not describe Benjamin Franklin as a starry-eyed optimist. He was far too aware of human foibles and failings for that, but he was a master politician with a gift for getting other people to build institutions and start programs that he himself had conceived of, but for which he never took the credit. And as a believer in scientific progress and discovery, Franklin certainly looked to the future with the expectation that the conditions of human life would be better. Although, to be fair, I don't believe he was so naive as to expect human nature to suddenly improve, or even gradually. Adams was even more of a pessimist. And for that reason, I think he gets depicted in a negative light during periods of celebration of our wonderful and triumphant revolution. For example, in the musical Hamilton, Adams is not even on the stage, and when he is depicted, it is in a very negative light. And if you will forgive me, the only line in the screenplay of Adams of Hamilton that I have is this. Forgive me for saying this. Sit down, Adams, you fat motherfucker. That's the only line concerning Adams in the entire musical Hamilton. But I digress. One more thought about that before I end my digression. This is ironic, given that Adams is one of the very few founders who never owned a slave and who was opposed to that institution for his entire life. But to return to my point, this strain of pessimism, not about the future so much as the flawed nature of human beings, was and is essential to the American form of government. As Immanuel Kant put it, with the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever built. With its focus on preventing power from becoming too concentrated in one leader or faction, eloquently stated by James Madison as the need to counter ambition with ambition, the Constitution is one of the straightest things that was ever built from that crooked timber. Today it looks fragile and endangered, but I don't need to remind this group that of all the things the world values about America, this is the most precious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha. And with that, I would offer the floor to Caitlin Kinder, please.
Thank you. While serving as Pennsylvania's colonial agent in London, Benjamin Franklin shared advice provided by a London solicitor on how best to present the colony's position ahead of the next parliamentary session to obtain, quote, for us, the good opinion of the bulk of mankind without doors. In the 18th century, official parliament business was secret, held behind closed doors. The expression people without doors referred to the public. Public opinion became a feature of the 18th century politics, fueled by the rise of the printing press and social habit of news sheets read in pubs and salons, so that even those unable to read could hear and know the news of the day. This evolved into a body politic that offered opinions regarding the business of government, even in political regimes where the public had little input in government policy or who its leaders were. In the same letter to the Philadelphia Committee of Correspondence, Franklin outlines plans to place items in the British press to, quote, efface the bad impressions received of us as the next session of Parliament began. Nearly 20 years prior to the Declaration of Independence, or the first shots fired at Concord and Lexington, Franklin, as a colonial agent, knew the importance of engaging the public. When I initially started researching American public diplomacy during the Revolution, I did not expect to find so many similarities between the concerns of the founders and the concerns of political leaders of a more modern era. The founders, at the start of the American Revolution, were facing an international environment of misinformation, propaganda aimed at undermining their arguments for independence. Public opinion still figured into the consideration of how best to get America's voice heard by those in power, though the most modern communication technology at the time was the printing press. And perhaps most importantly is the relative success of the founders' public diplomacy in a geopolitical landscape of tightly controlled monarchies. In spite of the lack of democratic political regimes in Europe, the founders still engaged publics there, spreading American political thought through its presses. This did not result in the immediate recognition of America's statehood. However, support came in small loans from European banks, large donations from the courts of Spain and France, and most importantly, private support in the form of merchant contracts for goods. America faced deeply entrenched European prejudices. The continent was widely viewed as savage, uncivilized land populated by convicts and indentured servants. European thinkers like Count de Buffon claimed America's harsh environment physically and mentally degenerated anyone living there. Franklin experienced some of these prejudices while serving as a printing apprentice in London. Those around Franklin were surprised that he could read and write. These perceptions added to the challenge facing America in its fight for independence. America saw a form of democratic government governed by the people, the fledgling nation needed support from other powerful states, such as France or Spain, both ruled by monarchs. If America was to entice foreign investment and trade, the country needed to demonstrate that it was worth the risk and prove that a democratic republic was a stable form of government. One of my favorite questions to ask my students is how they would approach some of the same problems confronting America as its plenipotentiaries sailed to different parts of Europe seeking support for America's break with England. More than a decade before, the American colonies fought with British against the French in the French and Indian War. Now those same colonies sought to be recognized as an independent nation separate from Britain. Who was America? What was America? Whose job was it to define America? Benjamin Franklin, Arthur Lee, Silas Deane, and John Adams did not have time to devise a plan. Upon arriving in France, the representatives were made aware of British propaganda efforts to further malign America. The British actively weaponized fake news, circulating rumors of American surrender, minimizing British losses, fabricating stories about Americans hanging Hessian prisoners after the Battle of Trenton. Arthur Lee voiced concerns about such stories heard in Spain while in court there and asked Franklin, the former newspaperman, to help counter such stories. Efforts to counter British malign influence and to establish the identity of America to Europe were greatly aided both by the French government and Franklin's professional contacts with news sheet publishers in the Netherlands. The French government tightly controlled the press through licensing. Prior to 1776, the government only sanctioned 2 newsprints. Upon Franklin's arrival in France, a 3rd license was granted to a publication, The Affairs of the British in America. Printed between 1776 and 1779, the publication provided historical accounts of the origins of the war, parliamentary debates in England, political documents from England and America, and political essays. The main contributors to the journal were Franklin and John Adams. Franklin's contributions occurred as the American delegation moved towards an open Franco-American alliance, and Adams' work came after the treaty was concluded. The first person Franklin contacted to assess European sentiment toward America and possibly obtain support for the war against England was fellow printer and editor Charles Guillaume Frédéric Dumas in The Hague. Dumas acted as an agent for the Continental Congress throughout the American Revolution, disseminating news and information about America and the war throughout Europe. Dumas also put Franklin in contact with the editor of the Leyden Gazette, a Dutch newsprint widely read throughout Europe. With the assistance of translators, Franklin had the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the state constitutions translated. No one directed Franklin or the other commissioners on the task of countering negative perceptions of America and its inhabitants, but they understood it as imperative to their task. No one discussed how to demonstrate to the world that a representative democracy would not lead to chaos. Today, we point to these very same documents Franklin had translated and printed throughout Europe as defining who America is, what we stand for as a nation ruled by people. Those documents demonstrated pragmatism and provided a government framework which might be worth the risk as a trading partner or as an investment. To quote Benjamin Franklin in a letter to the Continental Congress in March of 1777, "All Europe is for us. Our Articles of Confederation, being by our means translated and published here, have given the appearance of consistence and firmness to the American states and government that begins to make them considerable." While the founders made good use of the press, Franklin's education and exchange public diplomacy prior to the American Revolution facilitated much of their efforts to reach the European press, as well as assisting with the broader foreign policy and strategic objectives of the war. Franklin was America's first celebrity, the man who harnessed electricity, lightning. Through his work as a printer and a scientist, Franklin acted as a public diplomat through much of his life. His experiments with electricity and lightning captured the public imagination, famously entertaining King Louis XV. He was inducted into the Royal Society and the Paris Academy of Sciences. He used these contacts and relationships through these societies to find money and supplies for the Continental Army. Franklin used the global network of intellectuals as a backdoor to political power players. One of these relationships included the 18th century French chemist Antoine Lavoisier and his wife. Franklin frequently worked with the Lavoisiers in their home laboratory. Lavoisier was the inspector general for France's supply for saltpeter. While Lavoisier couldn't give access to France's supply to saltpeter, he could introduce Franklin to private sellers willing to contract with America. Lavoisier's father-in-law was the director of the Tobacco Committee for the Farmers General in France. And through this contact, the American commissioners negotiated a 2 million livre advance on tobacco shipments from America. And this allowed America to purchase his own packet ship to transport official correspondence between Europe and America. Franklin also maintained contacts with the Royal Society members in England, to include David Hartley, a member of Parliament. These connections provided the foundation for repeated prisoner of war exchanges and peace overtures. The founders sought the people without doors to counter nearly a century of anti-Americanism, to counter malign influence, and to tell the world who America was. It was through the founders' public diplomacy that America garnered vital, private, and covert support from the Netherlands, France, and Spain in the years prior to the Franco-American alliance. The founders engaged with the people without doors to secure the good opinion of the bulk of mankind for America's independence.
Thank you very much. That leaves Eric, last but hopefully not least.
Not at all least.
Thanks, Gordon.
Take it away.
Thank you, Caitlin and Martha. So let's time travel back to 1776, almost exactly 250 years ago. Philadelphia, for Benjamin Franklin. You've just turned 70 years old. You had a difficult mission recently to Canada in a failed attempt to convince the Canadians to join the cause. That didn't go so well. You spent 15 to 17 years, depending how you count it, in London in a very long and painful divorce with the British. Remember, Franklin arrived in London a proud subject of the king and left a rebel, basically. You have gout and psoriasis and a really painful kidney stone. And, you know, you could retire and do the colonial equivalent of golfing in Florida, I suppose. But the Continental Congress comes to you and says, Ben, because he was Ben to people, we really need you to go to France on this mission. And it's going to be dangerous. There is officially a war going on. British men of war ships are patrolling the Atlantic looking for people like Franklin. But Franklin had this personal policy when it came to public service, a two-part that later became a three-part. Number one, never seek public office. Number two, never turn down a request to serve. And later he had a number three, never resign, which he never really did. He never resigned from pretty much anything. And he was very bad at retiring, by the way. He was a terrible retirer. So he accepts the mission, of course, but it's a difficult crossing. He's with his two grandchildren. The British are after him and evasive maneuvers are taken. He arrives on the coast of Brittany. No one knows he's coming. And he's got very little to work with. And yet, some 7 years later, he signs the Treaty of Paris. The war is won. And I argue that after George Washington, Benjamin Franklin was the most important actor in the American Revolution. He was also the only of the founders who would be famous even if there was no American Revolution, because he was already famous for his electrical experiments, as has been alluded to here. So how did he do it? How did he pull this off? He didn't come up with a top 10 or a top 7 list, but I did. So here's what I think Franklin's key to success in diplomacy, and particularly public diplomacy, was. And also, I think these are absolutely 100% still relevant
today. Number one, work with what you have. The first U.S. mission was rent-free, free housing offered by a friend of the revolution, an arms dealer and playwright. I love that combination, arms dealer and playwright. It's true. He liked Ben, he liked the rebels, and he said, stay in my villa, and that became Franklin's residence and the de facto first U.S. mission. There was no printing press, so Franklin put one together in the basement. He started printing the first U.S. passports, copies of the Declaration of Independence. There was no national seal yet, American seal, so he used his family seal. He worked with what he had. Number two, see the world through the eyes of the other. And this is what I think Franklin really exceeded at. He saw the problem through the eyes of the French. He timed these requests for money, which were many, not to America's needs, but to the French budgetary system. It's just one small example. And he met the French on their own terms, in their own place, which usually was a salon late at night with a couple bottles of Madeira and chess and what some other American diplomats saw as frivolity. I think by accident or not, Franklin knew that this is where diplomacy takes place in France, not at the breakfast table, but at the dinner table and afterwards. Number three is actually appeal to people's bigness, largeness, not just saying, hey, support the American cause, what a new market this will be for the French, et cetera, et cetera. He knew that people needed bigger aspirations if they were going to fork over a whole bunch of livres. As he wrote to his friend Samuel Cooper from France, "'Tis a common observation here that our cause is the cause of all mankind and that we are fighting for their liberty in defending our own." There's something known as the Ben Franklin effect, and it goes like this. If you want to get someone to be nice to you, you don't do a favor for them. You ask them to do a favor for you. Franklin stumbled across this as a young man, and recent psychological studies show it's true. Why might it be? There's all kinds of theories. I think simply people like to be useful and helpful, and if you give them an opportunity to do so, they're going to like you. And that was Franklin's approach in France. Also, humor, which is not often talked about in diplomacy. I've got friends who are diplomats. They're generally not the funniest people, but they can be. But Franklin used humor to diffuse the tension. So at one point, there was a man who was a real pain in his backside, Lord Stormont, the British ambassador to Paris, who was spying on him, who was causing all kinds of problems. And he once started spreading these rumors, Lord Stormont did, that 6 battalions of Washington's army had been decimated. And Franklin was asked by journalists, was this true, Dr. Franklin? He said, no, it is just a Stormont. And it became a part of the French vocabulary. To tell a lie was to tell a Stormonter, to be a liar. And that humor diffused a lot of tensions. Another tool in Franklin's toolkit was his ability to wear many masks. And this is something that he picked up as a young man, 16-year-old, back in Boston, taking on the guise of one Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow, and writing these essays, so convincing, by the way, that men were writing in to the newspaper and proposing marriage to Silence Dogood, not knowing it was 16-year-old Ben Franklin. But throughout his life, he wore these masks. He wrote as an African-American, he wrote as an Algerian emir, he wrote as the King of Prussia, and he did it, A, because it was fun, but B, because it was a way of convincing people. He put on whatever mask worked. So, of course, in London, he played the role of the English gentleman. And as others mentioned earlier, in France, he wears a fur cap, which he picked up on that ill-fated trip to Canada, by the way. And he's not wearing a wig, and he's sort of the backwoods, Rousseau-like noble savage. And this really appealed to the French. John Adams suggested that Adams, he called him the old conjurer, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. I think Franklin was what the 1960s philosopher Alan Watts called a genuine fake. I think he could really play these roles so convincingly, and he was just he was expressing different aspects of his personality. What else? Be grateful. Franklin expressed genuine gratitude toward the French, and he thought that this gratitude served America's interests as well as French interests. Lastly, I think Franklin was an optimist. To disagree ever so slightly with Martha, I think he was a wide-eyed, not wide-eyed, but eyes wide open optimist. He's what is sometimes known as a possibilian. He always saw possibilities. And I read through a lot of his 15,000 letters, not all of them, and they are amazingly optimistic even when he's facing very difficult circumstances. He wrote a few very angry letters, but he never sent them. I call them placebo letters. He would wait 24 hours before hitting the send button. So optimism was, I think, one of his superpowers as well. That's Ben Franklin in 7 steps.
Okay, great. Okay, just before we go to questions, then let me sort of summarize what I've heard so far, and that is, since even before the creation of the United States, our diplomats engaged not only in high-level interactions, but they had media relations strategies. They published US documents so that other audiences could learn about US policy, including support for economics. You can point to the Declaration of Independence as a philosophical document, but it is a public diplomacy ploy. We were explaining our reasons for rebelling, and we were doing it for a global audience. Same with the Federalist Papers. This is an exercise in public diplomacy to get what were then 13 disparate colonies to join together in one effort under a constitution. And even George Washington's farewell address, where he remarks about no entangling alliances, was a policy that he presented publicly. And so from the start, we have chosen as Americans to try and use influence rather than coercion in the first instance of presenting our policies, but also our policies, which are internally developed, are developed with the thought that we are going to go public with them, and we are going to explain to audiences what we are about and try and convince them to join us rather than oppose us. Did I get that anywhere near right? Thank you. There we go. On to questions then. Please, if you are in the audience in person, please come up to the microphone. If you are online, please do the Franklin Electric thing and let people know you want to ask a question.
Thank you. We have a question from Ambassador Greta Morris, who asks, did American public diplomacy, in France during the revolution also influence France's own revolutionary spirit?
Volunteer?
I mean, I think it's you think about the course of events that we have realized now, like the French backing these rebels who want to get rid of a king was kind of gutsy. And I think it had to, I don't know of direct evidence, but I think it had to stir the pot, don't you think?
I would agree. Thomas Paine became a big proponent of the French Revolution, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense was one of the pieces that was translated by Benjamin Franklin, the publication sanctioned by the French government. To your point about the sanity of the French government entertaining a bunch of rebels antithetical to the monarchy, I think that was short-sightedness on their attempts to get back at the British for the punishing peace after the 7 Years' War.
I have a comment on that, if I may.
Yes.
Okay. I think Tocqueville was one of many people who made observations about the difference between the French and the American government. And one of his observations was that the Americans already had considerable experience in self-government because all of the colonies have been more or less self-governing since their inception. admitting, of course, that only part of the population was engaging in self-government. The others were being governed. But there was a lot of on-the-ground experience in the United States with representative government and a lot of theory that had been absorbed. And in the French case, it was a sudden overturning of everything. And the other factor that Tocqueville mentions is the importance of religion. He has a line which I can't exactly quote, that in France, the revolution was against both the king and the church. And in America, the revolution was against the king and the churches were with the revolution. And I think there's a lot of important differences between the two revolutions. And you can find that in the disagreements between the founders, particularly Adams and Jefferson, on the meaning of the French Revolution. One, again, more sober about the way people really are than the other, in the case of Adams and Jefferson.
I would note that in this 250th year since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, in the UK, where I have extensive experience, you will hear talk about the tax rebellion of 1776, where they boil it down to basically one issue. And I would point to the fact that they also say that it was the French Revolution which had the global impact and not the American. My answer to that is the Americans took French philosophy and some English philosophy, mixed it together outside of the realm of royal control and threw it back at them. And so we can take it for that one. Please.
Sherry Mueller, American University. Thank you for a very stimulating session. Wanted to ask the panel what they thought of 1776, the musical that recently played, and the founders, from my perspective at Ford's Theater, were very engaging. And then wanted to ask Professor Bayles if she would be kind enough to, if you were going to add to Through a Screen Darkly, which I've used often in class, thank you. If you were going to add to it today, what would you add to it? So thank you all very much.
I think those are both questions for you, Martha.
Yeah, the second one, how long have you got? I would add more notes of pessimism to be brief about it. I think I was a little too optimistic when I was writing that book, and I don't think things have played out in any in a positive way that I was rather hoping for and trying to encourage with the book. A big part of the book is the export of our entertainment and how that affects people's perceptions toward the United States. And I do think that's still the elephant in the room that public diplomacy sometimes talks about, but not very much. And I did a lot of traveling and interviewing overseas, and I found that it was a very large elephant in the minds of a great many other people, and not always in a positive sense. So that part I wouldn't change. I think 1776 was a pretty good movie, and I love the music. I haven't seen the stage production, but I expect it's pretty good too.
Next question, please.
Hi again, Carl Stoltz with PDCA, and also I teach at George Washington University on disinformation and propaganda. So fascinating talk today. Really appreciate everyone's comments. I'm gonna give you a fun, provocative question now. If you can take on the role, you did a very good job of projecting Ben Franklin with his gout and kidney stone and sense of humor and everything else, and role playing ability to take on different roles. Either one of you want to take on the role of John Adams. Let's project either, and yeah, you can be Hamilton if you like. I don't know. Project yourself 250 years into the future. What would each of them say about the current administration?
Next question.
Adams would say, "I told you so."
Yeah.
And Ben Franklin would say, "Too bad you are not keeping the republic that you made." And Washington would say, I don't know what Washington would say. I'll leave that to the others.
You'd say, don't
Well,
part about not having political parties.
I mean, I think Franklin would not be that surprised.
Mm.
would not be happy with what's going on. I think what would alarm him the most would be the tenor of our rhetoric, the public discourse, such as it is. Franklin made a great effort not to offend people. He really didn't like conflict, maybe because he came from a family of 15 kids. But he, from an early age, he realized he got more done with softer language. He didn't say, this is the way it is. He would say, it appears to be, or it seems to be this way. And to turn on cable TV or go online, I think, he would be alarmed at the discourse. Franklin had many adversaries, but very few enemies. And I think he would be worried that we are demonizing the other. And he reached across the aisle. I mean, he was not a religious man, but one of his best friends was a Reverend George Whitefield. And he had friends across the aisle. And I think that would be what he'd find the most depressing if he were to time travel back today.
I tend to agree. I think I think beyond just Benjamin Franklin, one of the things that comes across when you read the discourse of the founders and how they discussed or disagreed, sometimes they became very heated, but there was always this kind of, if not kind of Christian undertone of love thy neighbor as yourself, there was this certain level of respectability in public discourse that I think, regardless of, whether it's John Adams or Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, I think they would be genuinely appalled by the tone and tenor of public discourse. I'd almost like to think that Benjamin Franklin would get a chuckle over the manipulation and use of social media to manipulate people and misrepresent information, given how often he did take on different masks, as Eric pointed out in his remarks, but it was usually in service of the public good and not manipulation for self wealth or attainment of additional power. It was always in service of like creating a library or a fire department or public lighting and things like that. So I think the weaponization of public discourse and fissures in society would probably alarm him greatly.
Just a quick comment.
Franklin,
Lest you think I think Adams was 100 proof wonderful. He had a terrible temper and he was a very bad tempered and somewhat envious man. And I think he would look at what's going on now and see himself mirrored in a way that would be really humbling for him, because some of the traits that are brought out by social media he possessed, and it was a great weakness in his character.
Well, Adams was a Puritan from birth to death.
He was a deist.
Well, Franklin was raised as a Puritan and became what people consider to be a deist. Washington was Episcopalian. And I think the myth spread by Parson Weems about Washington not being able to tell a lie is a common theme for all three. So upholding the truth for them would have put them outside much of the political debate in this country today. Whereas Jefferson, who wrote lofty ideals and then continued to own hundreds of slaves, I think his hypocrisy would help him fit right in with what's going on.
ouch.
I take some exception about Jefferson. I've been reading Annette Gordon Reed's wonderful compendium of writings by Jefferson. She's a wonderful historian who's devoted her life to this enigmatic figure. And I do think Jefferson was a very complicated character. And I don't think I would resist reducing his very complicated attitudes on race and slavery to mere hypocrisy. I think our history is a subtle and complicated thing, and he's one of the most subtle and complicated parts of it. I would just inject that thought.
Right, yes.
I didn't hear that comeback.
He said it was an anti-UVA spiel on my part.
Ah, well, far be it from defend you at UVA. I'm in Boston.
The comment about Benjamin Franklin holding the letter for 24 hours before sending it. Abraham Lincoln famously wrote letters that he never sent. I have a feeling with social media, it's going to be really hard to hold back. But ignoring that, you're discussing foreign policy and vis-a-vis Europe. At this point, we considered Indian tribes to be foreign policy as well, right? The Indians are referred to in the Constitution as savages who must be controlled, or whatever the wording is that we use. Could you deal with our Indian policy in terms of foreign policy?
Oh boy.
I can say something about that. I don't know how many of you have seen all 18 hours of the Ken Burns series. He begins with Franklin's thwarted Albany Plan, which was evidently said to be inspired by the 6 Iroquois nations. I think the Constitution would have been written quite without the 6 nations. But I do think the Ken Burns thing does a very, very good job of doing this delicate matter of showing the tragic side of the American Revolution, both with regard to African Americans and enslaved people and the native peoples. I think it's done with great finesse and delicacy and fairness. And I attribute that to the fact that the screenplay for the thing was basically written on the basis of what I call the golden age of American historians. You know, people from Gordon Wood to Annette Gordon Reed and Joseph Ellis and McCullough and all these wonderful historians and biographies that I suspect a lot of you have read. That's the basis for this series. And I repeat again that if I was going to send a single production overseas, it would be that one. If you could get the rest of the world to sit still for 18 hours and watch it.
I just add one more thing. That is, you know, looking back at Franklin's life and his relations with Native Americans, of course, we're reading it through 21st century eyes, and always tricky. But sometimes he would sound just absolutely racist, basically. And I'm reading things he's saying about the Native Americans, and you know, I actually believe the writer's first job is to love, a biographer's first job is to love their subject. And I tried to love Ben, but there were times, like when he's talking about the Native Americans as savages, when I didn't love him. But then there are other times, there was an incident involving a gang called the Paxton Boys that were set out on killing a bunch of Indians, and they were about to march from, I think, Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And Franklin sort of single-handedly stopped them to protect the Native Americans. So yes, a complex history, and each aspect of it, relations with Native Americans, with African Americans, enslaved people, complicated, and particularly when you're looking at it through 21st century lens.
Yeah. Next question, please.
Karen Gladbach, PDCA member. The founding fathers, of course, were always talking about the men, and we know about Abigail Adams and the influence that she at least had on John Adams. I was wondering if there is anything out there in media or books that really talk about the many women who did influence the founding fathers. Also, diplomacy and the art of diplomacy. I was wondering, when did that become something that we started training and teaching? And lastly, kind of a fun question. I happen to be a Southpaw, and Southpaws always look for famous lefties. Benjamin Franklin has always been called a lefty. I can't imagine how he could have been in that time period, and I just want to know if that's a fact.
I think he was a lefty, but he doesn't write about it or talk about it very much, because it was right up until like last year. Like, yeah. That's a good question. Do you know?
I would say that in comparison to some of his other peers in the Continental Congress, especially Adams' own observations or criticisms towards how Benjamin Franklin lived his life. He had a common law marriage, wasn't married in the church, which in that time frame was kind of radical. He didn't attend church. He had a lot of I would say, critical thoughts of organized faith. He's still engaged with members of the cloth, and I think he enjoyed that intellectual kind of engagement. But I would say, like, in the context of his time, he was a little bit of a, you know, cosmopolitan. I think that's the best way to describe him.
So in other words, a southpaw. Basically, a little bit different from everyone else.
Yes.
Martha, do you want to address the founding?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually not doing publicity for PBS here. They don't pay me to do it, but I was so impressed by that series. And the series does a good job. It has a lot of quotations from Mercy Otis Warren, the famous Bostonian pamphleteer who was very active in publicly commenting on things, unlike Abigail Adams, who tended to do it more in letters to her husband. I think there were a number of women whose opinions mattered, even, indirectly to the founders. They obviously were considered, they're not in the paintings, but a lot of other people aren't in the paintings either. And the soldiers, one of the things that I've learned writing about this recently is that the armies were followed by large numbers of women and children who camped nearby, who cooked a lot of food and took care of their kids and served their husbands and served in various ways as their husbands were serving as soldiers. And these armies that we think of as all male had huge numbers of women accompanying them. I did not know that. It's really quite interesting. So I think in that respect too, these historians whose work is distilled into this documentary, this long documentary, are the best source for finding that. But yeah, like I said, there are a lot of people who aren't in the paintings.
On your question of when we started treating diplomacy as something that you taught, I think we have to go back to the first Foreign Service Act. Somebody help me,
1922.
1922.
The Rogers Act.
Before that, diplomats were appointed and were expected to pay their own expenses. So if you weren't rich, you weren't going to go. That was for the diplomat. It wasn't a diplomatic service. That was to be an ambassador, for example. We had the consular service, which was a uniformed service of the American government that established consular posts that were there to help American citizens, resident or doing business. That was a government service. They were joined together in 1922. I think after that, we began looking at diplomacy as something that we taught because it was opened up. We now had ambassadors who would be paid by the government as opposed to paid by, the family funds.
That is much more recent than I would have thought. Actually, that it wasn't. I mean, so in the 19th century, there was no foreign service. There was no.
There was the consular service.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Much later, cultural attaches were supposed to pay their own way.
Yeah. There are many things that were late developing that are surprising.
And I think the amendment was passed right around 1920. An enlightened time, I guess.
Michael, please.
Michael Korf, I'm the editor of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. I had a question that I had never thought about before, but you mentioned that they were trying to overcome anti-Americanism at the time that we were fighting the Revolutionary War. Many of us who have served overseas have had to fight anti-Americanism today. But could you say a little bit more about what was the image of the Americans at that time? What was this thing that they were trying to overcome? What were they fighting?
So there's been a couple of historians that have done some really great work on kind of, if you think back to when the colonies were first discovered, there was this great hope that these would be places of financial wealth. And if you're familiar with the early American colonies, it did not start well. There were a lot of failed starts, a lot of people died, illness, disease. The FIFA World Cup, a lot of our guests realized that, the temperatures here are quite different from Europe. It takes some adaptation. And for those who are from Central Europe, the wilds of America were quite harsh. Because of the harshness of America, what became kind of developed in the senses of Europeans was that the environment just was very savage, and as a result, it kind of fed into what this French scientist, he was the French scientist of the French court, wrote a thesis called the degeneracy thesis, where he talked about how because the environment of the Americas was so harsh, that it meant that you would actually devolve mentally and physically. And that perception persisted for over a century to the story, and I don't know if it's true, but I've been told this story. Thomas Jefferson is the first ambassador in Paris after we've, signed the Constitution. We're a free nation, and he's hosting a state dinner. He has Americans on one side, he has Frenchmen on one side. And this subject of the thesis kind of came up in the conversation. He asked all the Frenchmen to stand up at the table. He asked all of the Americans to stand up. And they are absolutely towering over all of these very petite English or Frenchmen. Okay. So in terms of anti-Americanism, there is a very interesting thread that seems to persist even after the efforts of the founders to kind of demonstrate that, we weren't degenerates, that we weren't criminals, that we actually read and write, we can quote Greek philosophers, we understand, British common law, and, all of these things that kind of, as Franklin and John Adams moved through the courts of Europe, probably experienced some level of surprise at their level of education and knowledge of classical and kind of established knowledge.
And I would add that America has, this is another thing from Tocqueville, America has long had the reputation of not having any accomplished arts of its own, because we borrow everything from Britain and everything from Europe, and besides we're Puritans, and Puritans don't have any theater and that kind of stuff. Tocqueville said all that. But we have over the years developed some highly original art forms that have pretty much conquered the world, which is why I'm sure everyone in the room thinks well of the jazz tours that took place in the 50s and 60s and other kinds of cultural outreach that have impressed the rest of the world with the kind of democratic but highly accomplished and refined products of our own distinctive American culture. I think right now that is in disrepair too, and I'm very concerned about our expressive arts and culture and what they say about us to the rest of the world. But I don't want to be a downer.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, thanks so much. I'm Maya Maranto, a recent graduate of Harvey Med College, and I really enjoyed hearing like all of the anecdotes about everyone. And so I just have a fun question, which is I'm curious if each of you could quickly take your favorite founder and give your favorite obscure anecdote that you don't think most of us would know. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
Oh, boy.
I'll
Well,
go first.
Okay, Martha, please.
I wouldn't say George Washington was my favorite, but I think he was the most important. And I think he was an extraordinarily interesting person. What I didn't know about him was that he was the least educated of all the founders because his father died early and he had to go to work. He never went to Europe. He never went to school in Europe. He didn't know Latin or Greek. And he studied a book of etiquette to learn how to act like a gentleman. And he also read very early on, he loved the theater, and he read this play, this famous play by an Englishman who'd been published a century before called Cato, about Cato the Younger, the Roman who fell on his sword rather than yield up the republic to Caesar. And Washington consciously modeled his performance. He was a performer too. He modeled his performance on that play. And at the end of the ordeal at Valley Forge, George Washington brought in a troupe of actors, as I understand it, to perform Cato for the troops. So that's a side of Washington I didn't know.
Caitlin?
Oh, there's a bunch, but let's see. I can try and do two quick ones. So Franklin discovered or created the lightning rod, which basically eliminated the risk of fires caused by lightning strikes, which was incredibly important when most of your structures are built out of flammable materials. And apparently, what developed in England was the politicization of Franklin's work, where the king commissioned people to distinguish between pointed lightning rods versus like square ones. And there were like divisions within the Royal Society between the Franklinists and the others. And he got into a bit of an epistolary back and forth with one of the people who felt that the other form of the lightning rod was better. And then the other one that I find kind of delicious, and I'm sure some other diplomats here would appreciate. Franklin's grandson was off the coast of Madeira, and he was basically running the Americas covert action program where they were pirating British merchant ships, sailing them into Marseille, stripping them down, selling off everything, and then outfitting them as warships. And Franklin commented to the Continental Congress that it was probably not ideal that the diplomat in residence was also doing effectively covert action. And he felt that the two were in contradiction with one another.
And can I get one in quickly? I mean, it's just that Franklin was, I'm a traveler and a travel writer primarily. And I discovered that Franklin was incredibly well-traveled. He was the most well-traveled founder of his time. He crossed the Atlantic 8 times, when in an age when arriving was not guaranteed. He had, I think, platinum status on whatever the carrier was. He logged 42,000 miles. Someone calculated this. As deputy postmaster, he went up and down the East Coast. He went to the Netherlands. And he once said, referring to Paris, he said, with the right mindset, 2 weeks in Paris can be as rich and rewarding as 6 months in New Jersey. No, not New Jersey, 6 months anywhere else. And I think, so he had he did some of his best writing on ships or in carriages, and he was America's first great traveler. In fact.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank our panel today for their presentation, Martha Bayles, Dr. Caitlin Schindler, and Eric Weiner. Judy Kang is our program committee chair, who will now close the program.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Judy Kang, and I have the privilege of serving as a co-chair of the Program Committee of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. As we bring today's program to a close, I hope our discussion, the first target audiences, the public diplomacy of the founders, leaves us with one lasting thought. Public diplomacy did not begin in the 20th century, nor is it simply a profession. From the earliest days of the United States, the founders understood a principle that remains just as relevant today. Ideas matter, communication matters, and the way we engage with people beyond our borders shapes not only how America is understood, but also the relationships we build for generations to come. As we reflect our legacy, their legacy, I hope we also think about our own. Every one of us, whether we are diplomats, scholars, journalists, students, I don't want to exclude them since a lot of them are here, or just engaged citizens, has the opportunity to practice public diplomacy in our own way. My hope is that when future generations look back on our time, they will say that we chose dialogue over division, understanding over misunderstanding, and engagement over indifference. If they can say that, then we'll have carried forward the work that today's discussion has so thoughtfully explored. Before we conclude, I would like to recognize the many people whose dedication made today's forum possible. First, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Gordon Duguid, one of PDCA's distinguished members and a former chair of our program committee. Thank you, Gordon. I would also like to thank Cindy Maddox, our PDCA Hans Tuck Graduate Fellow, our intern Cici Francisco and Anna Sabria, and Jennifer Fang, who served as our technical host and provided invaluable on-site support throughout today's event. A special thank you also goes to Michael Korb, who helped us today's online questions while continuing to lead PDCA's communications and marketing efforts together with our communication teams. And thank you, Bruce Guthrie, for documenting today's event. Finally, I would like to thank all of my colleagues on the program committee. Their commitment, creativity, and countless hours behind the scenes make these programs possible month after month. We are also fortunate to work alongside outstanding institutional partners whose collaboration is essential to the success of these programs. We are especially grateful to the George Washington University of Elliott School of International Affairs, the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the University of Southern California Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. We thank these organizations every month, but their partnership truly deserves special recognition, whether by providing a venue, helping promote our programs, or contributing their expertise. They make these conversations possible. Before we adjourn, I'd like to invite all of you to our next First Monday Forum on Monday, August 3rd at 12 Eastern Time. Our featured speaker will be Jeff Gatman, President and CEO of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. He will discuss MBN's evolving mission, the changing media and information environment in the Middle East, and the role of the US-funded international broadcasting in advancing independent journalism and public diplomacy amid today's complex geopolitical landscape. Following the public program, we'll host a 30-minute off-the-record discussion exclusively for those attending in person. So we hope you will be able to join us for what promises to be another timely and engaging conversation. Whether you joined us here in Washington, online, through our friends at C-SPAN, thank you for spending part of your day with us. We look forward to welcoming you again soon. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, and the session is adjourned.
Martha, thank you very much.
Hi.
It was a pleasure, Gordon.
Is that big